Mariah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name's Mariah Louca. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a woman. I'm a trans woman. I'm from the north. I'm from Sheffield. And I'm of MENA heritage. My father's from the island of Cyprus. I'm also an actor. It's really weird for me to call myself a writer when I'm just in the crucible of new writing.
We're all writers here.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
fab. I'm a writer. So I'm just dipping my toes into that kind of area now. But yeah, primarily an actor, but dipping my toes into being a writer.
So we'll jump straight to the meat of this.
Great,
So
let's do it.
in 2019, at 40 years old, and I feel bad giving you an age, I am 41 years old, so we have a balance, so we're all declaring our ages. You decided for the first time to start disclosing in the theatre industry that you're a trans woman. So before we talk about that decision, can you give us all a bit of an insight into what your career looked like before the disclosure? What sort of parts were you playing, and what was your experience of the acting profession more widely?
So prior to then, I'd been acting sort of kind of on and off for about 10 years, and had worked primarily at the Crucible Theatre up in Sheffield under the tenure of the great Daniel Evans, and had got involved in community theatre, and it was through sort of being around lots of young, hungry, up-and-coming kind of actors who were going into training and stuff like that, did I learn about training and going away to drama schools and kind of weighing up whether that was a kind of route that I would want to go. And I spoke with Daniel about that, and he was quite positive about, you know, any training, whether it's workshops or formal training, is a good thing. So yeah, I worked quite a bit at the Crucible Theatre for a number of years, first in the community theatre projects that they had there called Sheffield People's Theatre, and then in their sort of main stage productions, learning the ropes, as it were. And then in 2017, I went to drama school for a year and did an MA. And the kind of parts I was playing up until that point were, I played Queen Margaret, I played Tanya, I played, you know, the mother of a 20-year-old son. How dare they?
Yeah, exactly.
How dare they? I played, you know, the mother of a toddler who had died in this awful road traffic collision accident and was grieving, and, you know, and a police officer. So I was playing like a plethora of these complex female roles. Yeah, and then I decided to go to drama school and take a year out and really get that kind of training. So that was my year there.
So in 2019, you decided to take the step to be visible as a trans woman in the theatre industry. What made you take that step at that moment? What was it that pushed you to take that decision?
It was a number of things, really. I mean, I had mulled it over while I was at drama school. So while I was at drama school working with my classmates, I wasn't a disclosed woman, full stop. So for the majority of even my private life, I hadn't disclosed because I had transitioned a number of years earlier. So it just wasn't part of my identity at the time to be vocal about that. And certainly not in a new environment like drama school. It felt safer to maybe not disclose. It felt like that was part of my history, and why would that inform who I am today? However, having said all that, the industry and society at large was feeling like it was having that conversation with trans people much more expansively, and that there was an active, I don't know if appetite is the right word, but there was an interest in certainly engaging with more trans people, full stop. So that was the kind of seed that was planted in my mind as to whether or not, could I do this? How would that look? Of course, if I did that in such a public job like being an actor, that would inform the personal. So of course that would mean having private conversations with loved ones and close friends, etc. So it was a big thing for me to kind of mull over, and it took me a good 2 years to kind of figure out how that might look and weigh that up. Then I graduated from drama school in 2018, and I already had people who were working in the industry quite well, and they were quite embedded in a lot of the main institutions in our sector. And through a few of my contacts who I had disclosed to, I'd asked for some chats with industry professionals, namely casting directors. So I got to chat to 2 great casting directors, and the detail of those conversations really was about, what is it looking like for trans people right now in your industry, in our industry? How can you support trans people? What does that look like? Is it safe to do so? Why now? And the feedback I was getting was very much, I remember one of the casting directors said to me, we go to the AGMs every year, and the number one agenda item is diversity. And when we're looking at diversity, trans representation is the one that, we just have a black hole with. Like we can't fill that gap. We're not meeting what we want to have in terms of standards of engagement. So I said, okay, well then, what are you suggesting? And of course, that means they can't tell you what to do in terms of your private life, but what they're saying is, I think maybe if you wanted to add your voice to that, it would be contributing in some way to visibility. But of course, it's a very personal thing that you're doing. So is that something that you want to do? You have to go away and think about that and figure it out. So I did. And these chats coincided with an event that the National Theatre put on, a 2-day event, which was exclusively looking at trans artists, trans actors. So there had to be a degree of a level of professional engagement with the industry. So I believe you either had to have an agent or you'd been trained at a drama school. And if you met one of those prerequisites, then you could come into this 2-day event and you would meet a plethora of casting directors. You'd get to be in 2 different rooms and you'd meet an abundance of casting directors and get to sort of show a little bit of what you do. So I attended that. That was another big step for me to do that. And I met wonderful people like Tabby and Travis Alabanza. I spotted her over there. And it was great. It was actually really, really great to see the diversity within the trans community as well. So yes, I had that day there, and I listened to a panel discussion, and I met some great casting directors. And at the same time, I'd just been cast in my sort of first big play over in Belfast of a lyric. It was a sort of studio show, and I was one of the co-leads, and I was playing a trans woman. So that was the first time I really stepped into going, can I do this? How does this look? This is a woman who is in her 40s. She's trans. This is going to be very public. So I kind of tiptoed my way into disclosing. And as part of that, there was some press around that show. And I did interviews about it. And I remember one of the headlines was Mariah Louca plays, she's the first trans woman to be on a stage in Belfast. And I said, that you know of. And that was something that they were like, what? And I said, that you know of. Because maybe if I'd gotten a job at the Lyric, but in a different show, and it wasn't about being trans, I would have come across. And you may know that I'm trans, but you may not. So that presumption being there was an interesting angle for them to kind of consider. So that was my first foray into disclosing.
So you'd made that decision to make that big step. What was the wider impact then on your career at that moment? What were the pros and what were the cons as to what the outcome of that disclosure had on your wider professional life?
Well, I mean, clearly, if there was an interest to engage with more trans people, then I'm adding my voice to the conversation. I'm adding my face to the conversation, and so through that 2-day National Theatre casting event, I got into a few rooms and I had meetings about certain shows, which was fantastic, and I was really grateful for. One of them was actually here. I did Career Upstairs here at the Royal Court back in 2019. So definitely in terms of exposure, it gave me that kind of platform when there is a bit of a hole that they're trying to fill and they're trying to actively look for more trans voices and faces. But very quickly, I kind of realized that that's kind of where it ended. And also, conversely to that, there was it was quite clear that maybe some of the conversations I was having, it was for, a tiny part in this, which every act has to go through. We all go through that, process of doing any role that we can and wanting to be considered for us, by part of the conversation. But that was happening for quite a long time. And it felt like we could never even consider a trans person for a role that maybe had more at stake or there was more risk. Because what are we saying by doing that? Which was kind of bizarre to me to be hearing that. And that was coming to me in kind of veiled conversations. So yeah, I think, that's when you start realizing the tokenistic kind of performative nature of casting can sometimes come into play. And we need to be really careful about that. If we are asking trans people to come into the room, what are we offering? What kind of conversation are we having with them? you know, I was in a room that there was a female director in a room once who I just disclosed to quite early on, and then that got spread to quite a lot of the creative team, et cetera, before I had a chance to sort of have conversations with the creative team who I already knew. So transphobia can look in different ways. They can look quite low level, and it can look like they're doing the right thing, when actually engaging with the person in question is always the fundamental thrust of any movement, really. So it was a bit rocky after a while, because all of a sudden I realized that the box was becoming more limited, and I was only being seen in a very specific way. Whereas prior to disclosing, I hadn't had that problem. I'd been able to play mothers and wives and queens and soldiers and, you know, all of these different things. And all of a sudden it was either a trans character, which, great, if we're saying something really important, or it was part of a trans storyline, or it was a tiny moment in a play that didn't really say or speak to who I was and what I was bringing to the table.
I think that was the thing that was most shocking to me when we first started talking about your experiences, that huge range of parts that you were working with before suddenly became a very narrow diet of work, and that suddenly you were really ceilinged as to what directors, casting directors, artistic directors were willing to see you for, or able to see you for, considering the sort of plethora of work that you were having previously. A year ago, you put out a brilliant public call alongside Kim Tatum and Reece Lyons, published in The Guardian, which was calling for a broadening of the roles that we're talking about to trans actors, particularly for trans women, and what roles trans women are seen for and considered for in the wider theatre industry. Can you tell us about that article and the conversations that led up to publication?
Yeah, so there's quite a few moving parts to kind of inform that, really. I mean, I always want to say at the beginning, when I don't speak for all trans people, I certainly don't speak for all trans women. All I can speak to is my experience as a trans woman, and from those who I speak with and engage with, particularly trans women. And you know, the way that the industry tends to work, the way that the fashions and fads and trends seem to work in our sector, as they do in lots of sectors, seemed to be that queer representation was looking very broadly at different parts of the community at different times. And it felt like we as trans women, I just wasn't seeing us anywhere. I wasn't seeing people working, and I was going, oh, I aspire to that, or, oh, that's wonderful, that person's coming up and I'm interested to see where their career goes. We certainly had moments where people were doing that, and we certainly have incredible trans writers in the industry, but not enough. But I just didn't see myself anywhere. So again, you kind of feel like you're on this plank on a ship, and you're kind of you're walking the plank, and you're kind of like, I'm out here on my own, really. Where are we? At the same time this was happening, you know, stuff was happening over in America, again with trans actresses over in the States. I know Hunter Schafer made a statement that got, you know, quite a lot of heat for, because there was a lot of controversy around the fact as to why she was only focusing on trans women. But what she was saying is, I'm just not seeing us anywhere. There's not enough of us. Another incident over in the States was with an actress called Trace Lysette, who'd done a film called Monica back in 2022. It had taken many years for her to get this project going, and she came on board as executive producer. She's an actress who was in Transparent, the kind of TV series that was over in America. And she'd done this incredible film and EP'd it, and had gotten 2 Oscar-nominated actresses, Patricia Clarkson and Adriana Barraza, to star in it. So it got a lot of visibility, and it was a great, beautiful, meditative, reflective kind of film about what the trans experience could look like in a very non-stereotypical way. And she was getting lots of attention for it. She got to be on the TV show The View, along with Patricia Clarkson. She also had a feature in Variety magazine. So it felt like this was a moment that we were seeing this trans woman of a certain age. You know, she wasn't in her 20s. I think she's recently disclosed that she's sort of in her early to mid 40s.
Everybody's age.
But she'd hidden that as well because of what we can go on to talk about, which is the other kind of lens in which trans women are placed under, namely ageism, misogyny, all of that stuff. However, she was finding that she was not being invited to roundtables with this really important film that was having a really important conversation with the industry and with audiences, she wasn't invited to red carpets at award shows, and all of that, which we know is part of the kind of traction one needs to generate interest and publicity and therefore funding to keep a campaign trail going. And it just went cold, and this film kind of got lost, and she had to sort of retreat, and it's, I believe, still sort of, you know, quite hurt by how that process was. So that conversation was happening over in America, and I kind of felt similarly that we were doing the same thing over here. I think when I first disclosed in 2019, it felt like there was a burgeoning sense that that might start to appear, that we might start to see ourselves as trans people and as trans women in more spaces. And that just very, very quickly got deflated. I just thought, I just don't see us barely anywhere. I mean, the dolls, as we call ourselves in our community, you know, we all know when someone is in something, and so we applaud that, we support it, we go along, we try to champion it. And they are just sort of rare things that happen once in a blue moon. So I'd been mulling about this for a while. I had had a chat with Reece, who I'd started to get to know after she did the show Overflow at the Bush. We started to meet up, and I was starting to voice a lot of this. And I said, it'd be really interesting if, you know, we could do a sort of piece where maybe you and I interview each other. And as someone who's younger, who's coming up in the industry, and as someone who's a bit older, of a certain age, like those two perspectives might be quite interesting. So the wonderful Kate Wyver from The Guardian agreed to sort of do it. And then we thought it was important to have another voice in that. And we particularly wanted a Black trans woman to be part of that and to hear that experience. And also of a slightly different generation. You know, Kim is slightly older than me, and hence why we got Kim Tatum in, the wonderful Kim. So that's where this piece then came about. And yeah, we got to be on a sort of very broad national stage with that article, which was exciting for us at the time, because it wasn't just looking at theatre. It was looking across the board at, you know, film, television, etc.
It was an incredible article. What was the wider response to it? What sort of conversations did it open up?
I think lots of people seem to have read it. Lots of people seem to have seen it and was talking about it. I then went on a bit of a sort of journey of having meetings with lots of artistic directors, casting directors, yourself being one of them, and having really brilliant, meaningful conversations with them. You know, it seemed to really resonate. They wanted to hear more. They wanted to drill down and find the specifics as to what could they do to actually make this change happen. So that was really great to be able to do that, to sort of use the article as a way of going, now let's have the conversation. But a year on, and I would argue virtually nothing has changed, nothing at all. Unless I'm not privy to, which I'm not privy to every single conversation with every trans person and trans woman who's in the industry. But from the people I've spoken with since the article's come out, nothing really has changed. It's the same as it was a year ago.
I think that's part of the reason we're having this conversation. I get a lot of people wanting to come and talk to me as an artistic director about various issues and things that they want to bring to our attention or they want the organisation's action on. And very rarely do I meet an advocate as effective as yourself, who came in with the most practical and seemingly simple steps that an organisation could take to address some of the imbalances that you're feeling and some of the issues that you've been talking about. So to hear that a year on, it feels like, if anything, things might be moving backwards rather than moving forwards, I think is why we wanted to have this platform. We wanted to have this conversation, I suppose, in a way that could be more widely disseminated and sort of discussed. Talking about the moment we're sitting in right now, how are the trans female community feeling at this really difficult moment in time?
It's a lot. It's a lot. It's terrifying. I think we feel visible and invisible in the worst possible way. Again, going back to what I said earlier about trans people as a whole have got it horrendous. But the reason why I bat on about trans women specifically is because the lens upon which we have the gaze is somewhat different to the rest of the trans community. And trans men and trans masc individuals have their own complexity and nuance and obstacles that they have to overcome, as well as non-binary folk. And there is synergy and there is overlap with us, but I think to do that dilutes the individuality within our community and the spectrum within which we all sit. So trans women historically have always been seemingly the face of the movement. You know, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, have been those kind of vocal face advocates of the movement that we're talking about, really. And over time in this country, we've had April Ashley, Caroline Cossey, individuals who, for the most part, wanted to live their life relatively, you know, non-disclosed and get on with it. In the case of Caroline Cossey, she was somebody who was a model. She kind of came about in the 70s and 80s, and in the 80s managed to get into acting and was in the James Bond film For Your Eyes Only, and then was publicly outed in the Sunday tabloids. And when I talk about publicly outed, we're talking like front page Sunday headlines. So it always seems to be trans women that have that specific lens placed on them. That's what I feel like has been happening now with the Supreme Court ruling. I mean, we are talking about the definition of a woman. You know, let's make no bones about it. Of course, we're looking at gender as a whole. What does that mean for gender as a whole? But it's about what makes a woman. You know, we have been singled out of our community even to be vilified, to be demonized, to be seen as the enemy. And so it's a very wobbly place to exist in and sit in and feel that we're very unmoored. And that's why I think it's even more important that the arts are one of our saviors. The arts are the place where politics do happen. We respond, we platform the oppressed, we platform those who don't have a voice. So historically, I've not seen much change. And now that we are center focused and in the spotlight on a massive socio-political level, I am just hoping that it doesn't take this to get us, you know, in front of the right people to say, we need to be seen now more than ever. You know, the horrific murder of Brianna Guy was atrocious and horrific, and I think highlighted on a national level how vulnerable we as trans women and trans femmes are. And now we have it in law. So it's a precarious and prickly time to be existing. I think most of us feel very unsafe. And yeah, you know, as artists, we want to be able to be part of that conversation, to be platformed and pushed back.
Well, let's talk practicality then. So what can theatres, casting directors, artistic directors best do right now to support trans women actors in this moment?
Get us in the room. I mean, it's the same thing I've been saying. You know, I did an article on The Stage 3-4 weeks ago. It's the same thing. It doesn't really deviate. It's have conversations with us as trans artists, as trans women, want to platform us, want to include us in the conversation, not just tokenistically, but meaningfully, that you want us to be having conversations about stories that are important, that are universal, that have a diversity within them, of course. But where is that voice? Because every time I see a cast announcement, particularly one when there's a large cast, I'm looking for representation and I just don't see it. So it really is about being in rooms. And I think if we don't get in rooms, when we are invited in rooms, it's not just as a one-off or a tokenistic gesture, because we have to be allowed to fail to get better. We have to be allowed the opportunity to show what we can do and get it right and learn and read the room and take redirection in an audition. But if it becomes this one-off thing, that everything for that artist becomes staked on, they become like, oh my gosh, I managed to get a meeting about this particular production in this particular building. This is my moment. It becomes too loaded. You can't play as an artist to learn and fail and make mistakes. So I think the more we're included in that conversation, the more we're invited in, the better. And I sometimes hear that there's a fear around getting things wrong or saying the wrong thing. And I would always just say, be open. And if you make a mistake, be willing to have that conversation. You know, most trans people would rather have the conversation than just expect everyone to absolutely understand the nuance of the conversation that we're having. So for me, I think it's just, that's where it starts. It's casting. It has to be casting. And that's the responsibility of casting directors. It's also the responsibility of directors and producers and artistic directors to consciously think, we need to make more of an effort here, because it's clearly not a conscious thing that we're thinking of. I had a wonderful conversation not very long ago with a wonderful artistic director who I'm really fond of and I think is amazing. And they said, I'm really glad we've had this conversation because I would never have thought of it. And I'm like, great. If that's all that this has elicited, I'm pleased. I've done my job. Like, all I'm asking you to do is be now more mindful and more conscious of inviting us in. I think to just presume that somehow we'll get in a room or we'll get a conversation going, that's not enough. We need more than that. We need you to consciously think of it, because clearly we're getting missed. You know, yes, we make up 0.1% of the general population, but I don't see us anywhere.
So I think my job often as artistic director here is to be the stupidest person in the room and to ask the really stupid questions.
Ask the stupid questions.
So when we're casting for female parts, we should be spreading that net wide and open, and we should be actively inviting trans women into the room to read for female parts in plays. That's what you're asking for?
That is absolutely 100% what I'm asking for.
Couldn't it be simpler?
No, it couldn't be simpler. I think if you've got a four-hander and two of them are female identifying parts, and you're seeing 10 people, why can't 2 of them be trans women?
You're asking us not to do it once, so it doesn't pile a huge amount of pressure or a career-changing moment, but to do it across all of the work that we're doing.
I think it should happen all the time. I think with every production we're doing, it's the only way we're going to get into the room, create those connections, create those relationships, have that dialogue with the people who make the decisions, and say, this is the work that I can do. Whether we get the job or not, that's a separate conversation. I mean, I would hope that at some point we do, that we don't just get tokenistically invited in just for the sake of saying, I've invited you in. I want to see that manifest on stage. I want to be able to go to a show and go, oh my God, there she is. There they are, wonderful. But it has to be done regularly. I would say with every production. I don't understand the reason why one wouldn't. To me, it doesn't make any sense as to why you wouldn't do that.
And I suppose you're looking for meetings initially with casting directors in buildings and with producers and with touring productions to have that conversation, to advocate in the way that you have. And obviously that's something we're doing here at the court, and we're meeting with Sophia to talk about exactly what that would look like. But I suppose you're also asking for artistic directors and directors to advocate in the way that you have been brilliantly advocating for this on our side, to say this is fine, that we're confident in doing this, and that we're able to have that conversation. So as you say, people don't feel awkward or slightly hand-wringing or a bit nervous about having that conversation, or worrying about saying slightly the wrong thing and therefore doing nothing as a result and sort of being trapped in status.
Have the conversation. You know, we're here, we're ready to have the conversation. I think it's important to be proactive and to be seen doing that. And I think that's the way we'll make change. And, you know, I know that we had a bit of an offline conversation about the amount of work that it might take. It's not that much. No. It really isn't that much. It's not like we're redrafting policies. It's not that, you know, at one point I was thinking, God, it'd be great if we had quotas built in. But I know that buildings don't necessarily want to do that. But in terms of equality, this is a way of doing it without being forced to do it. Do it because you believe in it. Do it because you want to do the right thing. You know, on that, I've been told, which is kind of interesting, I've been told that I don't look trans enough for some roles. And to me, that's because what they want to do is they want an audience to be able to look at me on stage and know that I'm trans. And therefore the production gets a pat on the back to say, we're doing the right thing. And it's like, isn't it enough that you know? Isn't it enough that the creative team in the building know that we are being really inclusive and that we're doing the right thing, as opposed to having to communicate that out to audiences? So do it for the right reasons. Do it because you believe in it, and you believe that the talent exists. We exist as artists. We have so much there to offer. So yeah, invite us in.
You must be exhausted from all of these conversations and all of these unsolicited comments. You must be. So let's go beyond casting. What could theatres, what could producers be doing practically right now, wider, in a moment of real crisis for the trans community?
I think engage with us now. Invite us into meetings. I don't mean casting meetings necessarily. I just mean how one runs their engagement, community engagement, producers meetings, where there's an opportunity to speak for 10, 15 minutes. Have us in the room to understand what can we bring to the table at this stage of the process? What can we do to inform a process, and to give you more food for thought as to what that might look like for a production that you're going to put on. So I think if everyone is consciously thinking of that in all parts of putting a play on in a building, that's how we become part of the meaningful conversation, rather than just saying casting directors only. we need to have those wider conversations we were talking about.
So let's say we're jumping forward a year from today. What change are you hoping to see in the theatre industry? What are you hoping the landscape we're going to be sitting in looks like? And what are your sort of one or two things that you're hoping are going to come out of these conversations, these articles you're writing, and the brilliant advocacy that you've been hosting the last?
I see the dolls everywhere. I'd see us. That's the thing, David. It's like I don't see us. You know, it's so fleeting and momentary when I do see us as part of that conversation. I would see us in more spaces. I would see us at the major institutions in this city and in this country. I would see us there. It's visibility. It's a weird thing about being trans because unlike perhaps other parts of the LGBTQIA+ community, transness and to a certain degree intersex, of course, as well, communities, not everyone wants to be visible. You know, it's not about not being proud of who you are. Some trans people just want to get on and live their lives and don't necessarily want to be political, don't want to be activists. So I think it's bearing that in mind as well, is that for those of us who are visible, whether by choice or because we don't have a choice, it's important to ensure that we are serving those communities. You know, as actors, it's our job to explore the humanity of a character. I think Laverne Cox said this once, the great Laverne Cox. And the complexity of the characters that we are playing, we need to show that for those who don't have a voice. We need to show the ones who are oppressed. And so that's what I want to see. It doesn't always necessarily mean trans stories, trans characters. That's the main thing for me, is that we need more of those, but also how reductive if that's all we're scheduled to play. If that's all we're destined to be given, it's just reliving versions of our own lives over and over again, or those of our community, whether it's trauma, and great, joy as well, but also there's more within us. You know, as artists, we're multifaceted. We have a whole range of stories within us. Grief, you know, trauma, joy, family strife, you know, all of those things that every human being and every actor wants to bring to the table, we do too. So don't just place the lens on us for your trans, you know, the odd trans character, or great, we're going to do a trans story. We're more than that. We hold more than that within us. So yeah, I want to see more visibility, and yeah, I want to see more of me's out there.
I always end conversations like this, particularly when you're auditioning and people think that you know something that you don't. You always get interesting answers. But is there anything you want to say that you haven't said? I've had the most interesting responses to that question because they think you know some secret about them and you get all sorts of things coming out. Yeah.
I think I'm tired. You know, I know that I've been privileged for a long time of my life, and I stepped into that arena quite deliberately and consciously in 2019. And I've been really fortunate to be a part of some incredible stories with incredible storytellers, and I am forever grateful for that. And I will never forget those moments. But I see the reduction within which, with how that makes one exist as a trans person in this industry. So I want to see more visibility. And it is costing us something to have to step into the spotlight to say all this. That was also not my journey. When I transitioned a very long time ago, it was never to be public. And yes, that's a very privileged thing to say. It's also a very personal thing that I'm sharing by disclosing that. But we are nowhere, we are seen nowhere. I am seeing us nowhere. So I am trying to step forward to wave that flag and plug that hole and say, there's more of us, let us in.
We're going to retire and have some drinks in the bar in a second, but I just wanted to finish by saying two things. Firstly, thank you for coming to do this and have this conversation and to sort of allow us to capture it. I think it's a really important conversation to be having. And this is almost exactly the conversation we had almost a year ago in my office, and it feels nice to be sort of sharing it with other people. This is, as you say, cost you a lot of personal energy, but also I know you're rehearsing at the moment. You know, you're really finding time to do this, and I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me in, David. I really do appreciate that as well.
The second thing is, I think it's incredible what you're doing, and it makes me incredibly proud to be part of an industry that has such excellent advocates in it. Mariah Louca, thank you very much. Thank you.